Hello, everyone, and welcome to Friday edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Happy Friday, everyone, and thank you yet again for tuning in. We are going to conclude the week in a very special way, a fantastic amalgamation of segments set up for you guys today. We are going to start off in the NBA, looking ahead to the betting odds for the next season, for who will be our next champion. Then we will be looking at a 2-in-1 kind of deal for one segment, as we are not only going to recap the events of Game 5 in the Stanley Cup Final between the Panthers and the Oilers, we are going to preview tonight's Game 6 as well, so it should be a very special segment. Then we will also look at some of the stars in fantasy from this past week in the Euros tournament in Germany, so it should be another special segment. And we'll round out today's show looking at some of the rookie projections and stats for fantasy football. What is this rookie class going to look like? And we'll conclude the show looking at some of the fantasy hockey stars who impressed me over this season, so it should be a very special show. But before we begin, I always like to ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show, the many different podcasts that we have going on at the GSMC network. We also do receive a lot of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and of course the network, so anything you leave behind is greatly appreciated. Also, if there are any questions, comments, or concerns you feel have arisen from any of my prior segments or episodes, do feel free to leave them at the link as well, so that they can be answered at the beginning of my next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's show, the last show of the week. It should be a very special one. We start off in the NBA. I know that the finals have already happened. The Boston Celtics have been crowned as the champion, but I always like to look ahead a little bit. I always want to see what might happen in the next season. We're always on to the next thing. And so, I took a look at the early betting odds and decided, hey, why not present these to you guys so you can make your decisions on who might be the next NBA champions a little bit early when the odds are still short. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Now, this list is a perfect example of the parity of this league. You have your very top-heavy teams who are always going to be in the running, and then you have teams that have promise but might not be able to have sticking power later on in the season, and they might fall away in terms of betting odds. But let's look at the top half of this list, the more obvious half of this list. I'll start it off with the most obvious team at the top of these betting odds, in the Boston Celtics at plus 280. Out of all these teams, they have the fewest questions. All 12 players in their top 12 rotation are under contract. And if you look at this team, no words like luxury tax or reaching the second apron pertain to this team. Jason Tatum and Derek White, obviously Jason Tatum perhaps signing a Supermax extension, making him more rich than Jaylen Brown. He is eligible for that. And then Derek White is also eligible for extension. But outside of that, the only quote-unquote significant player this Boston Celtics would have to kind of re-sign would be Sam Hauser. That's how good of a situation they are in terms of having players tied down for a run at the repeat. And so Boston, well-deserved placement at the top of this list, mainly due to the fact that they don't have as many problems as other teams further down this list, including the second team on this list, the Denver Nuggets at plus 650, who are kind of shell-shocked, to be honest with you, after blowing that 20-point lead against Minnesota at home. And the big question with the Nuggets is obviously they have their kind of top 6 to 7 set. They have a set rotation that they're comfortable with, interchanging around the play and ball movement of Nikola Jokic. However, if you look at their bench, it is kind of barren, and it could get even more barren. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope is eligible for an extension. He might become an unrestricted free agent. But after losing guys like Jeff Breen and Jeff Green and Bruce Brown, who really helped you to that finals a couple of years ago, you really don't necessarily have a solid base you can rely upon outside of the players you already have on the court. You have guys like Jokic, Porter Jr., Jamal Murray, who's also going to potentially be eligible for an extension. He only has 1 year left on his deal. So you're looking at a Nuggets roster that has a fantastic foundation set in terms of who starts the game. But minutes have to be distributed somewhere, and they have to be thinking about that, especially with some other Western Conference teams behind them in these betting odds, in the Timberwolves and Mavericks. The Timberwolves, obviously, they're kind of in a weird situation where they are approaching the second apron. The future of Karl Anthony Towns is uncertain, but they still have a stable foundation surrounding their young star in Anthony Edwards and Rudy Gobert. And so I feel like the Timberwolves right now are the biggest challenge to the Nuggets because they are building their depth around them. They have guys like Naz Reid and Jaden McDaniels who stepped up in that series against the Nuggets to really propel them to that little run that they had in the Western Conference playoffs. And so the Timberwolves sitting at third, they could leapfrog the Nuggets depending on how their offseason goes and who they want to acquire. And also the Mavericks at plus 1,000, tied with a couple of teams at plus 1,000, are another appealing option because they only have a guy in Derek Jones who's not as significant to their whole team mindset as, say, some other players on other teams in the Western Conference. And so they are also frightening because they have the foundation of Luka and Kyrie. They acquired P.J. Washington and Daniel Gafford at the last trade deadline. And now going into the offseason, they don't have really many worries surrounding their core players in contract disputes. And so the Mavs could also be one of those teams to challenge the Nuggets. Then I kind of look down this list, and these next three teams are all kind of very similar. The Bucks, Thunder, and Knicks. The Bucks, obviously, I think the big question for them is what they're going to do with Chris Middleton, because Chris Middleton seems to A, be aging out of the team, and B, not as highly coveted as he was when Damian Lillard wasn't there. And so the Bucks' big decision-making has to revolve around that. They also have some other kind of free agents and also role players like Malik Beasley and Patrick Beverley who are up for extension and maybe want to sign new deals, might test the open market. But the Bucks right now, I don't necessarily see them as the second favorite behind the Celtics in the Eastern Conference race. I think the team a little bit below them in the Knicks at plus 1,600 could make some noise. Obviously, OG Anunoby's going to want some big money. He proved himself in the playoffs and in the regular season to be one of the key pieces as to why the Knicks were viewed as one of the more potent teams in the Eastern Conference. But he's going to garner a very wealthy contract. Obviously, Isaiah Hartenstein as well. He is also going to test the open market, in my humble opinion. And so the Knicks are a little bit of a question mark, but should they retain everybody, extend Brunson and Randall, I think the Knicks could be set up to challenge the Celtics, maybe even as a top seed, because when they're healthy, they certainly looked to be a fantastically built team. There are questions around Tom Thibodeau's style of play, but those can be answered later on in the season. And then you have a team in the Thunder just above them, also at plus 1,000, who are getting younger. Sam Presti has done a fantastic job. They still have guys on rookie level contracts. But the big question for them is adding a little bit more depth, especially in their rim protection facets of the game, because of Chet Holmgren's sheer size and length potentially being an asset, but B, a problem as well, because he's not necessarily built for sustainable minutes. And so they might be looking at a guy like Isaiah Hartenstein to kind of level off Chet Holmgren playing a lot more than he should this early in his career. And so looking at that group of teams, I think the Thunder are the most appealing option due to their young, skillful players, like guys like SGA, Jalen Williams, and especially Chet Holmgren. I'm really intrigued to see how he progresses. If he can bulk up, then he's potentially one of the best young centers or power forwards wherever they play him in the NBA. But also, should the Knicks handle their business in the front office well. I could see the Knicks being one of those teams in the Eastern Conference that can really put a scare into the Boston Celtics' repeat hopes. So I think the Knicks at plus 1,600 are my dark horse, and a team you should really look into in terms of betting, maybe as the odds get more volatile later on in the year. And then the Bucks, I don't necessarily think the Bucks are as threatening as people think. They're kind of in a transition period. I know that Giannis wants to tie down that supermax extension, but still, I see the Bucks as one of those teams that might fall apart later in the year, much as I do these two teams who always seem to have question marks around them, the 76ers and the Clippers. I think that the Clippers definitely I would fade. At plus 2,000, so many questions about where Paul George is going to go, what he's going to do. Obviously, James Harden's going to test the waters. Russell Westbrook might test the waters if he declines his player option. So this experiment could have worked, and it looked like it definitely could work, as they were one of the best teams in the league early on in the season. Maybe even midway through the season, they were also sustaining that level of excellence, but they fell apart, as these super teams often do. When you want to buy all these players, it comes with the consequences, and so that would suffer. And the 76ers, the process just hasn't come together. I feel like, Joel Embiid, yes, he's one of the better centers in the league, but he's always complaining about things. And Tyrese Maxey, he's eligible for a huge contract. Let's see what the 76ers can be. But right now, I think the most appealing odds are the Celtics, because they're the safest bet. The Mavs, because they're a team in the West that's slowly creeping up on all the others. And they're one of those teams that kind of free of the luxury tax for quite some time. And then the Thunder and the Knicks as well. I think the Thunder are definitely an appealing option in terms of longer odds. And then the Knicks in the East can definitely compete with the Celtics if A, they retain all their players and handle their business, and B, they stay healthy and Thibodeau manages the minutes better. That should just about do it for this segment. I hope you enjoyed this early look into the next season of the NBA. Should be a fantastic season with some incredible storylines to follow. But coming up next, speaking of incredible storylines, how about these Edmonton Oilers? We are going to preview Game 6 of tonight's Stanley Cup final game, and then we are also going to recap Game 5, in which Edmonton forced the Game 6. And yeah, I'm excited to talk more hockey. I was not expecting to, so we will be right back with that segment.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in...
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are back with another segment of today's show, but before we get into that very special segment where you guys get kind of a 2-in-1 deal in the fantasy hockey realm and real life hockey as well, I want to remind you yet again to please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is greatly appreciated. A huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let's jump right into this kind of 2-in-1 segment where I recap the events of Game 5 in the Stanley Cup Finals and preview tonight's Game 6 back in Edmonton. Now, obviously, the Edmonton Oilers were very confident coming into Game 5. They forced this Game 5 back in Florida. But the question was, will the Oilers overcome that mental barrier from traveling that far distance? And they did it in spades. They were aggressive in every facet of the game. The power play, short-handed, they were fantastic as well. In every aspect of the game that I pointed out that they needed to focus on, they did that to a T in both of these games. And here we are, potentially talking about the Edmonton Oilers historically coming back and winning this series. But let's recap this Game 5 in terms of fantasy. And the story was Connor McDavid, potentially the god of the hockey world right now. He is just an incredible player to watch. 2 goals, 2 assists, 14.5 fantasy points. He's slowly inching his way towards that record that the great one himself, Wayne Gretzky, set those many years ago for Edmonton as well, in terms of points scored in a single postseason. And McDavid, win or lose, he's probably the favorite right now to win the Conn Smythe Trophy, because he has been the most valuable player for the Edmonton Oilers, not only in the Stanley Cup Finals, but in the entire postseason. And then, how about Evan Bouchard stepping up finally in the Stanley Cup Finals with 3 assists and 9 fantasy points. Huge game for him, kind of to bolster his momentum and get it back. In terms of the Florida Panthers, they still had a decent game. Matthew Tkachuk came alive a little bit with 1 goal and an assist and 8.5 fantasy points. Obviously, fantastic for him, as he is seen as one of the leaders of this team. And then Evan Rodriguez, he's been one of those sleeper guys who kind of like rose like a phoenix from the ashes, become one of these players who, if Connor McDavid and some other players did not exist, he would potentially be in the running for the Conn Smythe Trophy, in my humble opinion. He had 1 goal, 1 assist, and 9 fantasy points for him. And then for tonight's Game 6, before I get into all the implications of that Game 6, if you are still playing daily fantasy hockey at the moment, you're obviously looking at McDavid, 11.4K, 19.2 fantasy points projected. And then Matthew Tkachuk, the leader of the Florida Panthers, I expect him to have another fantastic game at 9.2K valuation, 11 fantasy points for him. And a player on the Edmonton Oilers who doesn't get as much attention had a fantastic Game 5, Matthias Ekholm as a defenseman, one of their top line defensemen at 6.2K, and he's projected to have 6.5 fantasy points for you tonight. And also in terms of the Florida Panthers defensive scheme, another guy who should get it talked about a lot more, but hasn't been due to him being a non-factor in this series, in Aaron Ekblad at 5.4K, only 5.1 valuation for a top-line defenseman, a guy who's considered one of the best defensemen in the entire NHL. So he definitely needs to step up. And to get into all these implications, the Panthers definitely need to step up. Over these past 2 games, maybe it's the pressure of the Stanley Cup being in the building, maybe it's the aura that it presents, them being one of the only franchises in the NHL to not win a Stanley Cup and having that burden hang over their heads. Maybe it's just a lack of consistency, and the fact that the Oilers have finally figured out how to solve both Bobrovsky, who had been fantastic up to that point in the series, and also just getting back to what they've done so well in this postseason, both the power play and the penalty kill. It is their bread and butter. If the Edmonton Oilers win those battles, then they could potentially win this series. And also, Sergei Bobrovsky becoming more human has coincided with Connor McDavid becoming even more superhuman. There's some incredible assists, some incredible goals from him, and right now, the Edmonton Oilers, without a doubt, are looking like the more confident team in this series. When McDavid's playing like this, when his teammates feel like they are bolstered because of his play, they are one of the most dangerous teams. And Florida definitely poked the bear somewhere along the line. Also, the fact that Edmonton has been able to maintain that level of assured play, traveling these long distances, over 2,500 miles between both of these cities, is quite incredible to behold. And now they're traveling back to Edmonton knowing that right now, if they win this Game 6, the travel won't affect them as much. It will affect the Florida Panthers even more. Because if Edmonton wins tonight, which they very well could based on the way they are playing, then the pressure mounts on Florida. They don't want to fly 2,500 miles back home to fans who are getting a little nervous and potentially not necessarily being that satisfied with how they're performing. But if there's any silver lining in terms of how the Florida Panthers have played over the past game and a half, it's the fact that they have outshot the Oilers late in games. They are creating a lot of high-danger scoring chances, and Stuart Skinner is not the best of goalies. So if Florida can, outshoot Edmonton later in games, because I think the series has been getting closer as we enter the third periods of these games, Florida definitely has a chance to create some noise late in games, get some late goals, and build momentum that way. But right now, the Edmonton Oilers seem to be setting the standard. They seem to be setting the barometer that Florida just has not been able to reach. If Edmonton, especially if they get an early power play, or even if they go down a man and are on the penalty kill, and they did last game, they know that that is their bread and butter. They know that those are the most important facets of the game. Either getting a man advantage or being able to down a man, play their style of hockey, play physical. And also, I think this game is definitely going to come down to the two goalies. Will Sergei Bobrovsky regain his form, or will he be the Sergei Bobrovsky of the past two games? Will Stuart Skinner be able to do just enough to maintain his level of play these past couple of games and keeping Edmonton in these games? Because the key is, Edmonton Oilers defense has been stepping up a lot more than it has over the first three games of the series. But the question still is Stuart Skinner reliable enough to get you to a Game 7 and ultimately be good enough to potentially keep you in that Game 7 long enough so that the Edmonton potentially can win the Cup? And if that question is answered, then we're talking about an upset here. We're talking about a comeback here. And so the Florida Panthers' ultimate goal is don't let this series go back to Florida. You don't want to be going back on a plane with a series tied after you were up 3-0, because that is going to settle in your stomach in a bad way. You do not want to get off on the wrong foot in this game, because one silly penalty here, one silly penalty there, and Edmonton could be up 2 or 3 goals on you, and you don't want that to happen. If you're Edmonton, you are looking to build off that momentum from your home crowd. You are back home. You did the deed in Florida to get to this Game 6. And the Edmonton fans are going to be as raucous as ever. They are going to be cheering you on. They are going to want to see this high-level offense that you've been producing over these past couple of games. And ultimately, they're hungry for blood, man. They can sense the Florida Panthers. Something in their mindset has shifted. Something in the way they play has shifted. And so Edmonton is going to look to be on the board early and often to offset any kind of consistency the Florida Panthers will try to build early on from the past couple of games where they have played well in the third period but just haven't been able to get going. And so I'm looking at this game as one of those games where it's going to be really tough to see who comes out on top. Looking at the kind of betting odds and projections, Florida is at an even money line. They don't want to be touched. And Edmonton is actually minus 120. And the total over-under is 5.5. I don't know why it's set there, because this series has been very high scoring. I think this is going to hit the over. Ultimately, I can't necessarily pick a winner if Florida's money line is even, because that means that they consider Florida to make this a game, but also Edmonton being back home, you can't necessarily bet against just because of the fans wanting them to win. But ultimately, I think Edmonton will win outright, and I think it's mainly due to the fact that Connor McDavid right now, there's simply no answer for him. The Florida Panthers have done all they can to stop him over these past 2 games, and he's just risen to the occasion, and I don't think they're stopping him tonight. And so the Edmonton Oilers look for them to win this game and potentially force a Game 7 where Florida will be proper panicking. that will just about do it for this segment, though. I hope you enjoy these past two segments, getting kind of back into the basketball and hockey realm before we leave them for quite some time. But coming up next, we transition to the world of the beautiful game, where I'll be recapping some of my fantasy stars from this past week in the Euros competition. You definitely don't want to miss it. If you love footy, we'll be right back with that segment.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you guys have enjoyed these past two segments. But coming up for the next segment, we are transitioning across the pond to the European Championships taking place in Germany, and we are going to be looking at some of the fantasy stars from this past week. We have seen some incredible games, some incredible goals, just an absolutely cinematic tournament so far in terms of whether it be young breakout stars finding their footing on the international stage or these established veterans coming back into squads and really helping certain teams out. I really do believe that this has been one of the more exciting starts to a European tournament in recent memory. It just keeps topping themselves as the years go on, as teams get better. So without further ado, let's jump right into what should be a fantastic segment. Now, I think that this has been the tournament of the youngster. Whether you be someone who has risen through the ranks and are finally making your debut on the international stage, or young stars we feel like we've known forever but really haven't had the chance for their international teams to make some noise. The tournament of the youngster has been the name of the game over this past 2 weeks, and something I've realized when looking at these fantasy stars. And one German player in particular, one of my favorite players in the world at this very moment, is perhaps becoming the golden boy of this tournament already. And it's only been 2 games for him. Jamal Musiala there on the screen doing his celebration. 2 goals already in this tournament for a German side who has been looking for some consistency from their midfield, and they've been getting it in spades, especially from him. Unfortunately, they're inside the box. But here's the most impressive stat. 14 successful dribbles. 93.5% passing accuracy on 78 passes. He's completed 72 of them. And his 2 goals have come in 2 attempts. So Jamal Musiala, he's an incredibly creative player. He knows when to pick and choose where to go. His positioning is just incredible. His movement off the ball is especially incredible, especially considering the fact that teams have tried to make it more compact. We saw against Hungary that Hungary tried to solidify the midfield, cramp the Germans within that midfield space. Jamal Musiala interpreted it to perfection, and that is why I am sitting here saying he is potentially the best player in the tournament through these first couple of games. And I think his star is only going to rise as the knockout stages progress, and as Germany as a team gains more confidence in itself. They are looking to be one of the best teams in this tournament so far. Hopefully, when they do get tested eventually, perhaps against the likes of Spain, France, Italy, even maybe the Netherlands, considering how today's game goes, I think that Jamal Musiala is definitely going to be one player to continue watching as the knockout stages progress. I think that he is in a setup that works for him, and Julian Nagelsmann loves what he's doing, and he's going to continue to believe in him. Ultimately, he's going to need some rest, but Jamal Musiala, man, his star is quickly ascending, and he's quickly becoming one of the best players in the world. He's going to be tough to ignore for years to come. Now, switching over to a guy some of you may not know and set a very interestingly unusual record at this European tournament this year. Klaus Jasula of Albania. Here's his story. He came off the bench in a game where Albania took the lead early against Croatia. They fell down 2-1. Klaus Jasula came off the bench. He was the reason why Croatia had that second goal, because he was the scorer of an own goal. But fast forward to the 95th minute, he gets a touch in the box, boom, goal. He is the only player in this tournament, one of the only players in history, only sub in history, to have an own goal and a goal off the bench. While it's definitely kind of weird in fantasy, I just wanted to highlight him. He does have a goal off the bench. He could be a sneaky option for Albanian side that have looked very impressive in this group of death here. They took Italy the distance. They had to fight hard to win that game, Italy. And then they drew with Croatia, who definitely looks shakier than normal. But still, those are two very good results that Albania can take away, even if they get eliminated. They might be one of the 4 best third-placed finishers, and they might sneak into the knockout stages, but they should take merit out of those two performances. Switching over to another more young player, Klaus Jasula, of course, being 34 years old, we are transitioning to a more youthful player in Arda Güler, who a lot of people are saying have already scored one of the goals of the tournament from outside the box. Obviously, if you're a Real Madrid supporter, you may know some of his exploits. He hasn't played as much this season as people are expecting, and he definitely won't play anytime soon now that Mbappe is going to be arriving at the Bernabeu. But Arda Güler, at least on the international stage, is making a name for himself. 1 goal outside the box in 1 attempt, 93% pass accuracy, 3 successful dribbles in this tournament. So Arda Güler, definitely an electrifying player for a Turkish squad that a couple of years ago was everyone's dark horse and disappointed. This year, I think they're definitely going to be a dark horse in this tournament. They had an impressive 3-1 win over Georgia. Obviously, it's Georgia, but still establishing themselves, saying that, hey, last tournament, we failed to live up to our expectations, but look at us now. Arda Güler is going to be a huge part of that. I think he's a star boy in the making. We'll have to see if he gets any minutes domestically at Real Madrid, but he's going to be someone to watch in this tournament. Another player to watch on a very putrid England team. We're definitely talking about the game against Serbia rather than the one that happened yesterday. We talk about this young man, but Jude Bellingham. He scored the only goal for England against Serbia and definitely looked to be the best England player by a mile on the pitch against Serbia, the only one willing to do anything in that game. He had a 93% pass accuracy at that point, 4 successful dribbles. We're definitely going to omit that game against Denmark. It was a stinker of a game for everyone involved in the England squad. But Jude Bellingham, at the very least, put in a good performance that he can take heart from should England fail to meet expectations in this tournament. But honestly, I kind of feel like Jude Bellingham is an anomaly in this English midfield. He's the only player who really plays with any sense of creativity. Obviously, in Gareth Southgate's system, creativity is not necessarily at a premium for what he wants to do. But Jude Bellingham certainly is going to have to be the most creative player for this English squad if they definitely want to go hard, or they'll be flying home instead of saying it's coming home, because they definitely look a bit worse for wear. Now transitioning back to this German squad. One of the questions surrounding this German squad coming into this tournament was, of course, the defensive structure. Will the center-back pairing of Antonio Rudiger and whoever was the first choice for Julian Nagelsmann going into this tournament stand up to true tests? And against Hungary, that was a huge question, because Hungary definitely presented a lot more attacking threat than Scotland did. And the player at that second center-back position in Jonathan Tah is the one player who I was really critical of and kind of skeptical of being in the squad. But he has truly impressed me, especially in that game against Hungary. Fantastic defensive effort from Jonathan Tah to kind of dispel a couple of doubts surrounding this German defense. It definitely looked a lot more solid than it did a couple of years ago when they were in utter shambles. But now Jonathan Tah is restoring faith in that German defense. and it is becoming one of the quickly strengths of this team. 6 clearances in this tournament, 98.5% pass accuracy. Obviously, he's mainly passing it around the back line, so he's no Tony Kroos picking balls up the pitch, but it is what it is. If you were looking for a solid ball-playing defender in your fantasy squad. And ultimately, Jonathan Tah, he's gone from, in my mind, one of those guys who I will never trust to a guy who I would trust going forward in this tournament. And so, looking at Jonathan Tah's defensive standings so far, he has definitely been one of the better defenders in this tournament. In a tournament that has had goals galore, it seems like. He has been one of those talismanic defenders, especially in fantasy as well as in real life. Let's conclude today's Euros segment with a guy who has been doing it for many years. Many of you may not know him, but he is one of those unexpected stars who kind of shone brightest when the stage was big. And Dennis Mann, in one of the biggest upsets so far in this tournament. Romania 3-0 winners over Ukraine, taking control of that group. And Dennis Mann was a huge part of that. 2 assists in this tournament, and he took 2 corners. That's huge going forward. If Romania even make it out of the group, then that's huge. Looking for a guy like Dennis Mann later in the knockout stages. 4 successful dribbles, only 89% pass accuracy. He's not a huge passer, but Dennis Mann, kudos to him, man. Kudos to Romania for winning that game and taking advantage of Ukraine's team that seemed a little bit disjointed. But looking for these players in fantasy, especially in this tournament and early in the group stages of this tournament, is highly vital. Guys like Jasula and Dennis Mann might be a bit hard to come by, because looking at how you might want to set up your team, you might want more star players in your squad, especially in the midfield. But overlooking guys from lower level nations like Dennis Mann and Klaus Jasula may not be to your benefit, because of the fact they can always pop up in certain moments and always take advantage of certain teams that may look weaker than them, and that's exactly what Dennis Mann did. And so he is going to conclude this segment. Coming up next on this show, we are going to be looking at the rookie projections for fantasy football. Who will be the big stars in terms of quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers in the fantasy world for this rookie class. You don't want to miss it. We will be right back with it.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available every...
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you guys have enjoyed the segments thus far. Really exciting, versatile segments that I was really excited to present to you guys. But coming up now, we have another intriguing segment. We are going to be looking at rookie projections for fantasy football in terms of stats and where they might go in certain fantasy drafts. This is a very exciting crop of rookies that we have on our hands in the NFL. One of the better classes in recent memories in terms of all position groups as well. And so it's going to be a really intriguing breakdown of how these players might pan out in their upcoming rookie seasons. And so without further ado, let's jump right into it. Now, let's start off with a player who's getting overlooked in a position group where he was taken the highest out of that position group, Marvin Harrison Jr. There's a reason the Arizona Cardinals drafted Marvin Harrison Jr. And it's not just because his dad is a Hall of Famer. It is because he's a high-level receiver out of Ohio State. I could see him going as high as the second round in a 1QB league. I think he's going to be a fantastic asset for this Arizona Cardinals team. He is projected to have 158.9 fantasy points this season, over 1,200 yards, and 6 TDs. And I honestly think those stats are a bit too low for him. I think Kyler Murray is immediately going to utilize him as his number one go-to wide receiver on a team where the receiver room is very, very thin. And so Marvin Harrison definitely can't be underestimated in this position. Obviously, there are some guys out there who might be more appealing in better situations than Marvin Harrison Jr., but the Arizona Cardinals, at the very least, have a proven quarterback in Kyler Murray, who, when he does have the weapons, has the potential to get the ball to them. And so having a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr. on your team definitely elevates not only you, but Marvin Harrison Jr. as well, because of the fact he's going to want to better this Arizona Cardinals team as they make that transition. And so I could see him, at the very least, getting 1,200 yards, maybe even 8 or 10 touchdowns, in my humble opinion. And in terms of Superflex League, I could see him going third round, obviously, because different positions are at a different premium in the Superflex Leagues, and he could also get, like I said, over 8 to 10 targets a game to get him to that high touchdown total and that high yards total as well. So look at Marvin Harrison Jr. Do not sleep on him. And then another receiver who I think a lot of people are going to give a look at, but definitely has a much worse quarterback situation, is Malik Neighbors. Obviously, he's going to become immediately one of the best receivers Daniel Jones has ever had at his disposal. But he is one of those guys who might be taken much later in fantasy drafts than expected. He is seen as more of a round 6 guy in all formats. Maybe in a PPR league where receptions could be key, and obviously Daniel Jones is definitely one of those guys who prides himself on short to intermediate areas of the field. Maybe in PPR leagues he could step up and be closer to a 5th round pick. He is projected to have 129.3 fantasy points next season. He's also projected to go over 1,000 yards at 1,002. He's projected to have 5 touchdowns, obviously a little bit lower than Marvin Harrison Jr. But that, of course, is due to the quarterback situation there. But Malik Neighbors can be a very interesting, volatile pick. I think he can sit on your bench for a couple of weeks. You'll see how he plays under Daniel Jones. And then if he has a couple of nice games, maybe you roster him. But right now, he's an unknown commodity, mainly because of the fact we haven't seen the whole rapport between him and Daniel Jones just yet. And we're going to have that question answered as the games progress. And so, Malik Neighbors, while I really like him, he's an interesting prospect. He's definitely one of the better receivers in this draft class. I don't know if he's in the best situation to thrive early on in his rookie campaign because of Daniel Jones. And so that is why I think we are going to leave that wide receiver position group be for just a minute. Let's look at the quarterbacks. The quarterbacks obviously don't get talked enough about in fantasy. And so I just want to give them their due process right now, because this is one of the most talented rookie classes we had in a while in terms of quarterbacks. Obviously, you have guys like Caleb, you have guys like Jaden Daniels, even lowering guys like Drake May and J.J. McCarthy, and then kind of more projects in Michael Penix Jr. and Bo Nix, who are really interesting propositions in a league that's definitely shifting to a younger mindset in terms of the quarterback position. You want to get younger at the quarterback position, and so many different teams want to do that. So let's look at Caleb Williams, obviously in one of the better rookie quarterback situations right now in terms of the weapons he has at his disposal. He has DJ Moore, he has Keenan Allen now, and he also has Rome Odunze drafted alongside him as well at the number 9 overall pick. So he definitely has all the assets to thrive. The question is, what will he do with them? And so, looking at his projections for this year, he's projected to average 282 fantasy points this year. Not that bad. Kind of puts him in like the QB 13 to 15 range, if I'm being honest with you. He projected to have a 24 to 11 touchdown to interception ratio. He's projected to go over 4,000 yards, which is huge for a rookie quarterback. And it's mainly down to those expectations people have of him immediately stepping into the Chicago Bears system under, many different guys who want to help him and progress this offense. I think that he might be in shaky hands under Matt Eberflus. He's a more defensive-minded kind of guy, but Caleb Williams definitely isn't a quarterback who's just going to be a systems guy who just distributes the ball come what may. He's going to want to throw the ball far down the field and get all these receivers involved. I don't think Caleb Williams is going to go quietly into the night in his rookie campaign. I think he's going to come out swinging and guns blazing. And so, Caleb Williams, while I wouldn't necessarily take him, definitely not in a super flex league because you don't want to risk that second QB pick on a rookie this early on. In a 1 QB league, he might be a nice little backup QB option. I could see him going in the mid, third, fourth rounds. I definitely don't think he's going to be as high as other quarterbacks because we don't know what he is yet. And also in a rookie class that's kind of crowded at the QB position, who knows. So let's move to the next rookie quarterback who people are all abuzz about. Jaden Daniels, obviously a breakout season at LSU, vaulted him to that second overall pick in the draft. And he comes into a Washington Commanders team that might be a bit more unexpected than people think. They definitely have a structure they are building on the offensive side of the football that I really like. They added Austin Eckler. They already have two fantastic young receivers in Terry McLaurin and Jayon Dotson. They have a solid tight end in Logan Thomas. So Jaden Daniels is also set up for success early on in his career. Looking at his projections, predicted to have 207 fantasy points. He has over 3,700 yards and 21-11 touchdown to interception ratio. I think that's very solid for what people expect of him. And also, one thing he certainly has over Caleb Williams is his ability to run the football. Obviously, Caleb Williams runs the football, but more in a way to scheme people open. He's not running to get yardage. He's running to find people down the field, whereas Jaden Daniels runs to take off. And so that can definitely add upside to him, but also he becomes more risk to turnovers. So Jaden Daniels is also one of those flyer guys where I think he's going to put up major numbers, huge, gaudy numbers early on in his career. But also, due to the risk of running the football with your quarterback, he might be prone to turnovers, especially in a much more physical league. Whereas in the SEC, obviously you had that kind of NFL-level defenders bearing down on you. But also, I think that Jaden Daniels, out of this rookie quarterbacks right now, has the most upside in terms of what he can do in his rookie season, due to the fact that he can put up major numbers. And there's one guy to round off, the guy who everyone's excited about, mainly due to his speed and verticality, Xavier Worthy. I think that Xavier Worthy is going to be a very interesting gadget kind of player for the Chiefs. He's not necessarily going to be utilized just as a receiver. I could see him as a kick returner and punt returner as well. Projected to have over 843 yards, only 4 touchdowns, but 62 receptions and 120 fantasy points overall. As you can see, I think that people are kind of concerned because obviously speedy receivers in the past have not necessarily panned out in the NFL. But Xavier Worthy is unlike any fast receiver we've seen in recent memory because he can route run as well. He's not just pace. He's not just go and post routes. He is a route runner as well. He can run any concept on the route tree. So look for him and Patrick Mahomes to develop a nice little rapport, maybe a bit later in the season. But that should just about do it for this segment of this show. Our last segment for today's show, I'm going to take a look at some of the fantasy hockey stars that have really impressed me over this past hockey season. You don't want to miss it. It should be a fantastic segment to conclude the week. You are going to love this segment, and we are going to be right back with it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the last segment of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast for the day and ultimately the week. I hope you guys have enjoyed this whole week and slate of shows. But we are going to conclude the week with another great segment. We are going to be looking at the fantasy hockey stars that have impressed me over this past season. This is a group of guys who are on the younger side still, but have a lot of potential upside based on what they have done this season. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Now, these are some guys who, like I said, are still very young, so they could still have very volatile seasons next year as they get more experience in the NHL and get to learn more about the league. But ultimately, I'm really impressed with how these guys have stepped up their game, and I'm really intrigued to see how they still continue to adapt to the physicality of the NHL. So without further ado, let's jump right into some of the names on this list. Let's start off with a guy on a team that's really based around finding their identity in terms of how they play unselfish hockey, and Wyatt Johnston. He's one of those guys who comes into a very experienced Dallas Stars team who has wanted to reach the Stanley Cup Finals for many years but haven't been able to get over the hump, and immediately develops a rapport with his line mates Jamie Benn and Logan Stankoven, another young player. I think that Wyatt Johnston is definitely someone to watch because of the fact he's A, still young, and B, is on a Dallas Stars team that creates goals in bunches, and they spread the wealth around so much. So look for Wyatt Johnston to benefit from the way the Dallas Stars continue to develop their style of play. They're always going to be contenders in the NHL. So should you be one of those more daily fantasy hockey players, then Wyatt Johnston is going to become even more appealing as the Dallas Stars get deeper and deeper into the postseason. And ultimately, I think he's also going to be one of those guys who can consistently get 30 goals in this league. I'm really thrilled with how he's developed, and he's one of my favorite Stars players on that young, mixed team of youth and experience. So I'm really excited to see how Wyatt Johnston develops. Another guy who definitely has kind of grown up and matured in the NHL is Alexis Lafreniere. Obviously, a couple of years ago, he was famous for being on the kid line, where this bunch of youthful Rangers formed a line that was one of the most dominant in the NHL at the time, got them all the way to the conference finals. But now they've had to split it up because of the fact they're getting older, getting more experience in the league. And Lafreniere rises to one of those top lines, paired up with Panarin and Trocheck, I think on that second line for the New York Rangers. And he has completely and utterly elevated his game, unlike any other player on the kid line has over the years. He averaged 2.7 fantasy points per game since March 4th onwards. And in his final contract year, expect Alexis Lafreniere to want to show up and show out yet again. He's only going to grow from now on. He's gaining more and more experience. He's getting more and more confident in his ability in a New York Rangers team that's quickly becoming one of the better teams in the league. And so I think that Alexis Lafreniere, out of all these players on this list, has the best setup and is one of the most confident players on this list. Him and Wyatt Johnston stand above the rest of these players in terms of how far they can ascend in the NHL at this point. But still, there are some other players who I really am intrigued by on this list, including this guy, Seth Jarvis. I think that Seth Jarvis is also in a setup that really works for him in a Carolina Hurricanes squad that uses their speed and intelligence on the ice to be very aggressive in how they score goals. I love their style of play. And I love Seth Jarvis because he's another one of those guys, much like Wyatt Johnston, who steps into a very experienced team and immediately elevates his game to the level of the guys he's playing with. And so, look for Seth Jarvis to be one of those guys next season who's going to maintain that level of excellence in a playoff team. 315.5 fantasy points this year combined for Seth Jarvis, and he's a legit goal scorer as well. I can see him scoring 30 to 40 goals a season. And ultimately, Seth Jarvis I see as someone who can rotate in between lines and still be confident in how he plays, because of the fact that Carolina has this mindset of finding certain line combinations that they really like based on the skill sets of the players in this line. Rod Brind'Amour has done a fantastic job developing all these players managing them as well. So Seth Jarvis coming into the system really is no different than any other makeup of a player profile on the Carolina Hurricanes. He just melds into that squad so seamlessly. So Seth Jarvis is definitely one of those players who can break into that Wyatt Johnston, Lafreniere duopoly of young stars who can really fit into a squad no matter what. Now we're going to get more into more hopeful players, in my humble opinion. These are guys who had quote-unquote semi-breakout years, but I'm still kind of looking for at level of consistency. They're also on teams that might not have as much structure as the Stars, Rangers, and Hurricanes of the world. So these are guys who I'm kind of certain that might not, be on that level. So I'm going to look at a guy in Philip Koroshev who has had stretches of consistency, but on a Blackhawks squad that's still developing. They're still young. They're still trying to figure out how they're going to build this team. I still think that he has room to grow. He did collect 7 goals and 12 assists in a 10-game period in the month of March. He is line mates with Connor Bedard, so if Connor Bedard is healthy for all of next season, look for them to potentially be a very dynamic duo. But right now, for where the Chicago Blackhawks are at and for where Kurashev is at, I still think that he's not going to break into that trio of stars due to the fact that Chicago has just too many questions around it. While you can definitely be a very good player on a much worse team than others, you still need to have teammates you can rely upon to up your own level of production as well. And right now, Philip Koroshev doesn't really have that. And looking at a guy in Jake Neighbors and a Blues team that's kind of becoming one of those more middle-tier teams. They were one of those dominant teams in the league a couple years ago, but right now they're kind of in that weird stasis where they're neither a Stanley Cup playoff contender or a team that's looking ahead to the draft. Jake Neighbors is definitely a player to watch. The Blues are definitely a very exciting team. They definitely have their teammates, but they're not at the level of guys like Panarin and Trocheck for Alexis Lafreniere, guys like Sebastian Aho, Toivo Teravainen, Nino Niederreiter, Martin Necas for Seth Jarvis, or guys like Logan Stankoven, Jamie Benn, Thomas Harley, another young star, Jason Robertson, and Rupe Hintz for Wyatt Johnston. And so, Jake Neighbors, he had 27 goals in 27 games, and he should be a top 6 power play player for some people who are in categories leagues. Jake Neighbors just feels like one of those players who's very flash in the pan-y. I think that he's going to be good for stretches and bad for stretches, because the Blues are also one of those teams that's good for stretches and bad for stretches. So Jake Neighbors is one of those players who's just in that weird stasis of, I don't know if you should draft him, but he could potentially have a streaky little campaign. And then we go to a player in Jaraj Slavkovsky, who's one of the youngest players on this list, who also has two experienced line mates in Nick Suzuki and Cole Caulfield, who are also still very young as well, who, out of all these players on this list, obviously has the most untapped potential, only 20 years old, and it's very young in the hockey world. He had 12 goals and 18 assists in 30 games from January 15th onwards. And so I do believe that he's one of those young breakout stars who, as the Montreal Canadiens get better, could potentially rise to the level of a Wyatt Johnston. But right now, he's mainly focused on adapting to the NHL. He has done it before. So I'm looking at Jaraj Slavkovsky as one of those guys who might be an interesting utility piece for next year off your bench. And so that's all I can say about Jaraj Slavkovsky at the moment. And then a guy in Brock Faber on the Minnesota Wild with a fantastic defensive season for him as a defender. He's a top 25 fantasy defender in my humble opinion. Really battling with Connor Bedard for that Calder trophy. And so Brock Faber obviously not necessarily viewed as highly as some other defenders in this league, but he was just a rookie last year. So he did average 25 minutes per game, also huge in categories, also huge as he's a defender. So I really think that Brock Faber is one of those guys who I'm definitely looking out for. And then last but not least, a guy who's been around the block, a guy I'm very familiar with, and a guy I did not expect to see on this list, it's Stuart Skinner. He ranked 55th, as we saw yesterday in the 2024-25 fantasy hockey player rankings, and he ranked 3rd in wins this year. Obviously, there's still going to be a lot of questions about him. He's still in the Stanley Cup Finals. If he wins that, maybe some of those questions get dispelled and those notions get dispelled. But right now, Stuart Skinner, he didn't have an impressive season. Nobody expected him to win as many games as he has, and no one expected him to be in the Stanley Cup Finals as the Edmonton Oilers' #1 goalie. So, if Stuart Skinner continues to exceed expectations, the Edmonton Oilers maintain this Stanley Cup contender status, then of course, why not take faith in Stuart Skinner as one of your fantasy goalies for next year? But that should just about do it for this show, this day, this week. I hope you guys had a fantastic week. Hopefully you're watching this show. I've really had a joyous week talking about so many different sports. Glad to get some fantasy football in there. Glad to still have some fantasy hockey to talk about, and also glad that the European Championships are going on. Hopefully you guys are also watching the Copa America that is taking place in the US of A as we speak. But thank you guys so much for tuning into this show. It means a lot to me and the network. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show if you like it. Also consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. Is a huge support to us at the network, me and my fellow podcasters as well. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We will be back next week with even more great shows from the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Chris Shepard. Thank you guys so much.